etc. So today we're very pleased to present Dr. Curnutt, and he's got an interesting collection of stories he's put together, the Montgomery stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald. He is executive director of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society and also serves as the managing editor of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. He's a professor and chair of English at Troy University, and he's made mention that his office is in downtown Montgomery. It looks out towards Pleasant Avenue, where Zelda Fitzgerald was raised. He is the author of Cambridge Introduction to F. Scott Fitzgerald, among other books, and is the editor of the Oxford Historical Guide to F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I'm sure he's got other accolades, and he can reveal them or not as he chooses. So with that, welcome, Dr. Curnutt.
Well, great. Well, thank you for having me. It's appreciate everybody giving up a Saturday afternoon in the middle of football season to for the Fitzgeralds. I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and share my screen, because I think it'll be a lot more interesting to look at pictures than it will be to look at me. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and hopefully you can all see that. Just hold on just a sec. Let me try this again. That one, the slide was not moving. So let's see. There we go. So I have put together this past year 3 stories about Montgomery, Alabama. And the way this book came about was there is a Alabama publisher whose offices are here in Montgomery. And they came to me in 2019 and said, you know, we know 2020 is the 100th anniversary of a lot of Fitzgerald landmarks. It's the kickoff of his career. It's the 100th anniversary of his and Zelda's marriage. Is there something we could do that would be kind of fun? And I said, well, you know, there's these 3 stories that he wrote about Montgomery. He didn't call it Montgomery, and he kicked it across the state line over to Georgia, probably not to upset his in-laws or Zelda's friends. But I said, these stories, they've been republished and they've been in big collections of stories together, but they've never been published as a trilogy. And I think they are 3 stories that fit together really well as a kind of trio. So they liked that idea. So we, in honor of the fact that all 3 of them center around Southern belles, we decided to call it All of the Bells. And we were very fortunate that a few well-known Southern writers, including Lee Smith, were willing to blurb it for us. But if you don't know the basic story of the Fitzgeralds or how the Fitzgeralds met, it was because of the Great War. F. Scott Fitzgerald joined the U.S. Army in 1917. It was either join the Army or flunk out of Princeton. And Princeton had a program to where you could go into the Army without officially being thrown out of Princeton. And he never actually did go back and finish his degree. For many years, Princeton was sort of ambivalent about him, and it's only been in the last few years where they've tended to celebrate his time there. But he went into the Army, and he went first to Kansas and then Kentucky. Kentucky is important because he used the Louisville setting there for the Great Gatsby as opposed to Montgomery. But eventually, by the summer of 1918, he ended up at Camp Sheridan, which is just north of Montgomery. And he was sent in October 1918 up to Long Island on Camp Mill, and his troop was boarding a ship when an influenza outbreak halted the deployment. And by the time they were rescheduled to go abroad, of course, the armistice occurred on November 11th. So he always felt a tremendous amount of guilt for never getting to the Western Front. And 20 years later, he wrote a fantastic story called I Didn't Get Over, which I think captures a lot of the frustration of young men of his age who wanted that experience of having served in the army during the war. Um, and it's interesting that he was halted by the influenza outbreak because that's a detail that nobody really ever cared about in Fitzgerald's studies, of course, up until about March. And then all of a sudden, my phone and email started blowing up with people asking, well, what was Fitzgerald's experience during the influenza pandemic? And the reality is he was surrounded by it, and he caught a very mild case of it in 1919. But overall, like most of his generation, he did not write so much about the N1H1. I think that's it. Is it N1H1 or H1N1? I can never remember. But he didn't write about the flu, despite how catastrophic that was, and it did hit Camp Sheridan very hard while he was there. Zelda Fitzgerald, Zelda Sayer, was born in Montgomery. She had just turned 18 as they were meeting. So it's very important to understand that their relationship was essentially an adolescent one. He was 22 and she was straight out of high school. She was the daughter of a state Supreme Court justice, was known as a very artistic young woman in town, known for dancing and for painting skills. What wasn't widely known up until a few years ago that she actually wrote creative writing before she met Fitzgerald. And just to tell you a funny personal story, we had a meeting here about 7 years ago where we brought in a bunch of our Fitzgerald Society members. And as we were preparing for it, I was hanging out at a local indie bookstore, and the guy that owned it said, you know, I want to show you something. And he took me into the back room and he pulled out this tattered little publication dated 1918. He said, my grandfather was in high school with Zelda Sayer, and this is their literary yearbook, their literary magazine, and it has a story of hers in it. Do you know this story? And I looked at it and I read it, and I thought, you know, I believe I've read just about everything ever written about the Fitzgeralds, but I've never heard of this story. So I ran and checked all the sources, and sure enough, that story had been undiscovered. So we scanned it and put it into the program for our conference. And it so happened that the Fitzgerald's granddaughters came to our conference and they saw the story, and I asked them if they had ever heard of it, and they said no, and they thanked us and asked us for a copy of it. So I emailed it to them, and then about 3 weeks later it showed up in the New Yorker. So that's my one claim to fame, is that I helped find this short story just by virtue of standing around in a bookstore one day. It tells us that there's a lot of interesting discoveries left out there to be. But if you're interested in it, you can just Google the iceberg in the New Yorker and it'll pop right up. Montgomery, a lot of this talk will be about Montgomery, Alabama, which I think is a fascinating city, very fraught, historically fraught city. But the Camp Sheridan was built just north of town. And Montgomery was a very small southern provincial city, despite being the capital. It only had about 40,000 residents. And so when the soldiers were brought in 1917, it effectively doubled the population of the town. Almost 40,000 soldiers came in. And there are a lot of wonderful postcards floating around where you get to see what the camp installment looked like. The camp will be an important setting in a lot of fiction that he writes, even when he's not necessarily setting his stories in Montgomery. But this photo here, for example, is another postcard. And I always like to tell people, as iconic as Scott and Zelda are, usually when I show this to folks, they say, well, that's got to be based on Scott and Zelda because it looks just like them. But the reality is that postcard was printed before they ever met. And I think what it demonstrates to us is that as iconic as Scott and Zelda became, they actually modeled themselves in a lot of ways on ideal images of young people at the time. Very famous story about Scott getting his army uniform custom made for him at Brooks Brothers. So he was not one that was going to settle for an army issue uniform. But above that is an excerpt from his ledger that he kept throughout his life. It's kind of his bank book and his diary. But this page from September 1918, if you look at the first line there, right by where it says September, it says fell in love on the 7th. And that's generally considered the first reference to Zelda. They probably met sometime in August. He was notorious ladies' man in the army. He dated a lot of different women. So when he met her, it was pretty quickly a intense relationship on his part. It took her a while to warm up to him for reasons we'll discuss. The house that she grew up in has been torn down for about 45 years now. But this is a photo of what it would have looked like in the 1970s, just as it was being prepared to be hit the wrecking ball. It had been abandoned for 40 years, so there was not much left to it. And their daughter tried to save it, but it just wasn't going to happen. And this is a photo of her sitting in her mother's rose bed at the side of it that same summer of 1918, getting ready to go to a dance where she was performing. But the house is very important because it figures into not only all three of these stories, but just about everything he wrote. One of his recurring themes or motifs was of a young soldier, middle-class young soldier, falling in love with a young woman of a slightly higher class. And that relationship becoming a sort of test of his worthiness. That's the story of the Great Gatsby. So when we read portions of that are set at Daisy Faye Buchanan's house, that would be modeled something along the lines of this house as well. I know it doesn't look like much, but again, this was just a few weeks before they tore it down back in 1975. Unlike Hemingway or many of the other authors that preserve their homes, there are only two places that Scott Fitzgerald ever lived that are even accessible to the public anymore. One of them is up in St. Paul, which is one of the homes, the childhood home, and it's simply an apartment that a resident up there willed to the public library. But for more than 30 years, Montgomery has been home to the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum. And I arrived in Montgomery in 1993, and I volunteered there for almost 26 years. And it's one of a network of author homes that exists throughout the country. Many of them very hard hit by the pandemic. You may have seen in the news recently that the John Steinbeck home in Salinas has been shut down and is trying to raise money to raise money to eventually reopen. And Ernest Hemingway's birth home as well has been struggling. The Fitzgerald Museum is eked by in the pandemic in part because back in 2017, they converted the upstairs, which had been a rental property, believe it or not. For many years, we had, people that I, knew around town rent those apartments and live there, which was a little awkward when you're trying to run a museum. But they've turned it into an Airbnb, and they had a lot of success with it before the pandemic hit. In fact, for 30 years, the museum tried to get somebody from the New York Times to come down and write about what they were doing there. And it wasn't until we made the place over into an Airbnb that the Times got interested in it. One of my favorite things when I used to lead tours at the Fitzgerald Museum is I would bring them into the sunroom and I would show them a version of this photograph. And I would say, now, look at the floor in the picture and then look at the floor you're standing on. And it was very cool because there was always a sort of shock of recognition. People love to be in a place where they can sort of feel like they're sharing the space of a famous writer or a famous personality. And this is a photo that was taken in this house in Montgomery. It's a little later on. It's 1931, maybe early 1932. This was not too long after she was released from a psychiatric clinic in Switzerland, where she had been for 18 months. And you can tell she looks fairly healthy here. If you look at photos of her just 6 or 7 months before this, you'd be shocked because she was so emaciated during her stay at the clinic. This was the beginning of the end for the Fitzgeralds. They came back to America in 1931 and hoped to kind of restart their lives in much humbler circumstances, thanks to the Depression. But almost immediately, they had a lot of marital issues, partly sparked by the fact that Zelda wanted to write. And her only novel, Save Me the Waltz, was started at the house in Montgomery. It was finished up in Baltimore, but that's the cover of the first edition there. And this was the author photo that went with it. It was from the series of photos that accompanied the book. This is the most famous version of the story, a little happier one. But part of the reason that I love this photo and always enjoyed telling people the story of the photo is because when I was a kid in the 70s, my mother and her friends all had this book by Nancy Milford, this paperback book from Avon called Zelda, which was the first biography to really look at Zelda's life. This is a book that's enjoying its 50th anniversary this year. After she wrote it, Nancy Milford didn't write another book for 30 years until in 2000, she released a wonderful biography of Edna St. Vincent Millay. And honestly, she has tried to live apart from this book. It's considered a landmark in women's biography, but I think she kind of soured on it because she was so typed by it. I was trying to get an interview with her this past year as a way of celebrating the 50th anniversary. And, it's a good thing in my life I'm used to rejection because we just got nowhere with didn't even get a reply to the inquiry. And I think she just feels like she has long ago moved on from the book. That said, it tends to still be a really highly regarded biography. Probably at the Fitzgerald Museum, the thing that my biggest contribution was when we held this conference a few years ago. I took that Zelda photo and had a friend of mine who's a graphic designer colorize it and blow it up. And so now when you come to the Fitzgerald Museum, you can get your picture taken with Zelda. And this has been the most popular item in the museum for 5 or 6 years now. I actually had it stored in my office for a while, and the cleaning lady asked me to get rid of it because she said every time she opened the door and flipped on the light, she was terrified, thinking somebody was in the room. So fortunately, the museum wanted it, and it's become their big hit. But if you go to the Facebook page or to the website for the museum, you can see a lot of the pictures that folks like to take with it. There is a Connecticut connection to the Fitzgeralds. As you probably know, there's been a lot of publicity lately for the documentary Gatsby in Connecticut. And shortly after they married in 1920, they spent about 6 months living up there in Westport. And there's a famous adventure that they took in July of 1920, where Zelda supposedly woke up one day and was homesick for peaches and biscuits. And so they jumped in their used car, and they drove 1,500 miles down to Montgomery, long before the interstate system was around. And he tried to write this cross-country adventure up into a travelogue. It took him a few years to get it published, but he called it The Cruise of the Rolling Junk. The Rolling Junk was their nickname for the car that kept breaking down. But it begins in Westport and it ends in Montgomery, and it's a fun bit of comedy. By the time they roll into Montgomery, the car literally falls apart as it hits town. But it's an interesting story that talks about, gives an idea of what it would be like to actually have driven across country in a car at 20, as you can see, 27, 28 miles an hour, which would have made for about a 3-week drive. They ended up taking the train back because the car ride was so traumatic. We actually had plans to redo this trip over the summer, and that was one of many events in 2020 that we had sort of scheduled. We were going to live blog it along the way and try and do all sorts of things. And of course, when the pandemic came, it just threw everybody's life in turmoil, and nobody felt safe doing it. So we have had to put it off until we may do it in 2024, the anniversary of when the article was actually published. But you can get a sense here. This is an example of the type of photograph that accompanies it. And this is a stage photo from a few years later, but you get a sense that for as great of a writer as he was, Scott had a sense of humor, and they enjoyed comedy. This collection that we put together, as I mentioned, has 3 stories. And the first of them, 2 of them are from 1920, and then the third one is from 1929. So the first one is called The Ice Palace, and it takes half of it is set in his fictional version of Montgomery, and the other half is set in St. Paul. And it's a story about a Southern belle who is courted by a Yankee, and when she goes up to visit Minnesota, she realizes she is not fit to live among the Nordics up there, and comes racing back home to her beloved South. It's a very important story historically because it's part of a burst of stories that Fitzgerald wrote in 1919 and 1920 that got him into the Saturday Evening Post, which was the most widely circulating magazine of its time, the highest paying magazine of its time as well. At the time when he first started off at 23, landing in this magazine, he was only making about $400 a story, but by the height of his career, a decade later, he was being paid $4,000 a story. And that's in 1929 dollars, which would be about $70,000 today. So we tend to forget that he wrote a lot more than The Great Gatsby, and that in his own time, he was really better known as a popular short story writer than as a novelist. What's fun to me about this story is this particular illustration, which is a rendering of one of the key scenes in the Ice Palace. It's supposed to be a local cemetery called Oakwood, which actually predates the history of Montgomery by a year or two. It still exists today, as we'll see in just a second. Looks very much the same as this. And Zelda and her friends used to hang out a lot at this cemetery. What all they did there, I'm not really sure, but it was kind of the place where young people in Montgomery went to hang out. And so in a key scene of this story, the young woman whose name is Sally Carroll, she very insistently, she insists on being called Sally Carroll because, of course, women in the South have to have 2 names. And this is her beau Harry, who takes her to the north. They have this long kind of conversation about whether a Yankee can really understand what it means to be a Southerner. And it makes the story a little difficult to read in this day and age because it is invoking a lot of that lost cause rhetoric that is associated with the Confederacy. In Oakwood, a lot of the Confederate government that started out here in Montgomery is buried, and there is a long stretch, a hill, which has a lot of unknown Confederate soldiers buried in it. Now, Fitzgerald was fairly iconoclastic at this point of his life, so this whole scene is played for laughs. And as Sally Carroll and Harry wander through here, and she's saying, the South is all about loss and about, this yearning for a better time, they end up having a makeout session in the cemetery, and it's pretty. I mean, it's I think it wouldn't raise an eyebrow today, but for 1920, it was a fairly racy sort of moment, and it gives us a sense of how Fitzgerald, I think, gave the Saturday Evening Post a jolt of youthful energy. Before him, the Saturday Evening Post was really known as the magazine that your parents would read, and not a lot of younger college types necessarily subscribed to it. And he made it. He gave it a makeover and made it something that young people wanted to flip through. The most famous resident today of Oakwood Cemetery is actually Hank Williams, and it's a little bit disturbing to me, but this is a big tourist stop in Montgomery, and what people do is they usually leave beer bottles on his grave. If you know anything about Hank Williams, he died January 1st, 1953, probably of an alcoholic seizure in the back of a Cadillac. So to me, it's always been a little disrespectful for people to leave beer bottles there. When I went and took this picture, I actually moved a bunch of them off because I just wanted to get the the headstones of both he and Audrey, who was Hank Jr.'s mother, as well. But it is an important landmark in Montgomery, and there's actually scenes that are set in Zelda's novel "Save Me the Waltz" of her father's grave, which is not too far from Hank's grave. So if folks come to visit, I always insist that they go visit Oakwood Cemetery to get a sense of Montgomery history, but also to see where Sally, Carroll, and Harry would have roamed. The second story that Fitzgerald did was about 4 months later, in the fall of 1920, and it's a very different story in both tone and mood. This was a story that in his development, he realized that he could write a sad short story, that he could write a popular story that didn't have to have a happy ending. A lot of his Saturday Evening Post stories that he did right before this are fairly formulaic. Now in the Ice Palace, the couple does not get together in the end, but it's a comedy, so that's part of the point. But in this one, this is a story about a young man, again, who's pursuing a very popular young girl from the country club. And this appeared in a magazine called Metropolitan Magazine, which would have been, I think, probably more akin to Vanity Fair or the New Yorker, or a magazine that he also published in at the time called the Smart Set. Much more urban, much more sophisticated, much more glamorous, aimed at a much younger, much better educated, to be perfectly honest, demographic. So for example, when you see this young man with a flask in his hand getting ready to hand it, that is something that the Saturday Evening Post, even though they would have had, illicit drinking maybe in a story, but they certainly wouldn't have pictured it, I don't believe. Jelly bean was Southern slang for a slacker or a Southern layabout. And the whole point of this story is this young working class young man, he lives above a garage, has always felt excluded from his peers. And he is finally recognized by this young lady, Nancy Lamar. And he does her a favor. He covers her gambling debts at the local country club. And in the end, she throws him over to marry the heir to a disposable razor blade fortune from Savannah. And the shock that she actually gets married after on a drunken night out with this guy is kind of a cautionary tale, I think, for Fitzgerald about where his generation might have been going with all of these new freedoms that he experienced. His was the first generation that enjoyed the freedom of teenagers having being able to drive around in cars. And that's a big theme in a lot of his stories where he's writing about young people. He included this story in his second short story collection called Tales of the Jazz Age, which he brought out in 1922. It's a story that gets overlooked a lot because it's again, it doesn't quite have the originality to it that maybe some of his better known stories do. But again, chronologically, it's a very important story because I think this is the first one where he realized he could really harness his natural inclination toward melancholy and produce a story that would get into commercial magazines, but didn't have to have a happy ending. It's an important story locally because it's one of the first recountings or first fictionalizations of him and Zelda meeting at the Montgomery Country Club. And this is a picture of what the country club would have looked like in 1918 or 1919. Now this one burnt down in the 30s and it's since relocated kitty corner across the street. But this is what the interior would have looked like. Now this always shocks me because I think this looks more like a hunting lodge than a country club. But again, the country club would have been a more hangout facility, and they did have dances here. And it was supposedly in this environment during a dance that Scott and Zelda met. You may have seen a couple years ago, it's still on Amazon Prime, and I do recommend it. There was a 9-part, I believe, what they called a bio series called Z, which is based on a novel from 2013. Christina Ricci played Zelda Fitzgerald, and it's a fun story. It got kind of half and half reviews, but I do recommend it. They took a lot of liberties to it, but they were true to the basic overall chronology. It was kind of fun for me because as they were preparing this story, I was contacted by the showrunners, and they asked me to Skype with the writers' room. And I thought, what do I possibly have? What can I possibly tell? Hollywood writers? But they were asking me, well, what scenes would you consider absolutely essential in all of this? And I said, well, you should go read the story of the Ice Palace, because if I were you, I think the cemetery scene would be absolutely wonderful, because Zelda did take him there, and he, even outside of the Ice Palace, he writes about it a little bit. So fast forward about a year, and we get an invitation to go visit the set as they were filming in Savannah. Now, they didn't film Montgomery in Montgomery because we have not preserved our houses the way Savannah, Georgia has. And we also don't have the tax cuts that has made Georgia the Hollywood of the South. But we did get to go and see some films being seen. There was one point where they were shooting at a house that was supposed to be 6 Pleasant Avenue, and we're there with the director, and we have headphones on and everything, and we're looking at the shot, and all of a sudden Christina Ricci walked by, and I locked eyes with her. And, I sort of thought she might knew who I was, but of course she had no clue, and was probably figuring how this bum get off the street and wander in here. But they did also invite us out to a scene that was supposed to be a love scene out in the cemetery. Looked absolutely nothing like Oakwood Cemetery, flat as can be. But they started filming this kissing scene, and all of a sudden they took a break, and the director came up to my friends and I, and he said, well, we're going to have to close the set now because we're filming a sex scene, so you guys will have to leave. So I got about as this far getting to watch it. It's not very explicit, but they used body doubles in the scene. But it's interesting to see how the sausage gets made, I guess. But if you do have Amazon Prime, I really do recommend that you watch the story. It is pretty interesting. And you can judge for yourselves whether they did a good or middling job on it. One of the things I like to do when people come to Montgomery is take them to the site where the original country club was. And today it's a Sonic hamburger stand, which says something about how we've preserved history in Montgomery. This area still has streets called Country Club Drive, so you kind of have to go up behind this particular hamburger stand but that whole stretch there would have been where the country club was. So it's a little bit sad that it's no longer standing, and it's indicative of how a lot of the sites associated with them in Montgomery, like her house at 6 Pleasant Avenue, have totally disappeared. In 1929, Fitzgerald originally toyed after publishing those two stories with cranking out a number of other stories about Tarleton, which is what he called Montgomery. And he just decided not to do it. I think in part because he did not want to get stereotyped as someone who wrote a short story series, which were a very popular form at the time. Later on, he would do a series of stories about growing up in St. Paul and another series that was based on his first girlfriend. And together they are known as the Basil and Josephine stories. And then way later in life, in 1940, he wrote stories about a Hollywood hack publicity guy named Pat Hobby. But early in his career, I think he just didn't want to have to commit to cranking out these types of stories about bells. So he didn't go back to Tarleton for almost 10 years. And when he did, he produced The Last of the Bells, which is I think the best, the most mature, I think certainly the most meaningful of these three stories. It's just an absolutely beautiful piece. It captures that sense of nostalgia that we associate with Fitzgerald. The idea of the story is that this young man who was once stationed at Camp Sheridan comes back to Tarleton 10 years later, and he looks up the most popular belle of the day, a young woman that he was interested in but didn't want to have to compete for against all of the other soldiers in town. And it talks about their friendship. And as I often tell people, it's really not a love story. It's more a story about a friendship between men and women, and that moment where they sort of realize that they are not meant for each other, but what they've lost in doing that. And it's also a story that I think talks very powerfully about Zelda's generation of belles and the limits that they experienced. Theirs was the first feminist generation, the first generation that was allowed to vote. We just passed the centennial of that, of the suffrage movement. And he ties all of these landmarks that gave all of these women freedom, but it really didn't give them a clear professional path. So when Andy comes back to Tarleton 10 years later, what he discovers is this young lady, Allie Calhoun. She's all of, early 30s at this point. For Fitzgerald, once you're in your early 30s, you might as well be dead. There's just nothing left for you after you're 30. It's very much like Jerry Rubin, I guess, in that way. But he sort of realizes the tragedy of being a Southern belle is that the thing that made you most popular was your youth, and once that's gone, you've lost it. So the story ends with him and Allie going back out to where the camp once stood and trying to find it. And what I like to do when people come to town is take them to the one little island in town that remains of Camp Sheridan. It was torn down right after the war ended, and by the winter of 1919, all of the camp installation was gone. So all we have left is this marker and a little bit of a plaque. They acknowledge that Fitzgerald was here, but they don't do anything with any of these three stories. So it's a little bit of a sad note, but it gives you a sense of again how Montgomery has struggled to do much with its history. Montgomery is a fascinating town because it has a dual competing history. When I first came, again, it sold itself as both the cradle of the Confederacy and the birthplace of civil rights. It was called the Cradle of the Confederacy because this was the first Confederate capital. Jefferson Davis was inaugurated here in February 1861. It was the capital only for about 6 months. They moved it up to Richmond in part because Montgomery is just too swelteringly hot for the Confederate government to really cope with. Not that Richmond was cooler, but they had more amenities back in the day. But Montgomery has also had a very difficult racial history. In 1850, it was the biggest slave market in the United States. This always blows people away when I tell them this, but it was bigger than Charleston, and it was bigger than New Orleans. It was also the reason that a certain firm that is notorious in this day and age started up here in town. You may remember 12 years ago when the first Great Depression that we've had to live through struck. It was because of the financial meltdown precipitated in part by the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers got its start in Montgomery when it was a dry goods store, retained the name and went into all kinds of different financial services and eventually ended up on Wall Street. But it played a role in the slave trade as well. And so in downtown Montgomery, where we have an artesian well that is a fountain that is our central landmark, that has a very difficult history because that's where the slave market was held. And again, I've been here almost 30 years. And when I first came, people didn't talk about the slave market. It's only been in the past 6 or 7 years they've even been able to get these plaques installed around town to acknowledge the negative side of the Civil War history. This is what the Artesian Fountain looked like this past summer. And you can see down at the end of the street is the state capitol where Jefferson Davis was installed. What you can't see is just to the right of that is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church where Martin Luther King preached. So just think of Martin Luther King and Jefferson Davis separated by a century, but separated only by about 50 yards, maybe 100 yards. And you get a sense of the intensity of the juxtaposition that we live with here in Montgomery. The fact that Black Lives Matter was decorated around the fountain in the aftermath of the George Floyd controversy back in June, to me was astonishing. It happened in part because only a year ago did Montgomery elect its first Black mayor. First Black mayor in the history of Montgomery. We're the last Southern capital, the last city of our size in the United States to elect a Black mayor. And so we've really been undergoing a lot of change, trying to catch up with things. And I think it was a very meaningful step forward, regardless of what people think about Black Lives Matter. I myself tend to support it, but I should mention that for all of the the demonstrations that we had in Montgomery, they were all peaceful, and the community and the police got along very well. So I think the fact that we had a mayor who was intent on letting people express their feelings, but doing so safely and making sure the police understood the need for that really made us a bit of a role model. And keep in mind, all of that was going on when we were at one point in May and June, the highest COVID rate per capita in the country. I mean, we were just overwhelmed by it. So a lot of fraud history here in Montgomery that's very difficult to deal with. The birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, as I mentioned, Martin Luther King was preaching here in 1955 when Rosa Parks was arrested, and it kicked off the Montgomery bus boycott. I'm very proud to say that I have two offices. I taught for 23 years on Troy University's Montgomery campus. For the past 5 years, I've taught in Troy, Alabama, which is actually the hometown of John Lewis, who just passed away. So in the coming months, you'll be seeing a biography by John Meacham, very well-known historian, called The Boy from Troy. That's where I teach, Troy, Alabama, and it's a point of pride, our university. Now, our university, denied him admission in the late 1950s because of segregation, but we made amends with him really by the late 60s, early 70s, and he has very important attachment to our campus, visited several times, of course. And we just recently, after his death, renamed one of our central buildings in his honor, getting rid of the name of a former governor who happened to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So that tells you the sort of way that Southern history is still very, very controversial in this day and age. Keep in mind also, I should tell you that all of that was happening when our university was struggling through a controversy over our chief of police expressing sentiments about the Floyd murder on Facebook that cost him his job, quite frankly. So there was a lot of intense feelings going around, and we felt very good that we were able to peacefully and optimistically acknowledge John Lewis's place both in Montgomery and to our campus. I go into all this racial history for one very important reason. In April 2018, there opened in Montgomery the National Memorial for Peace or Justice, and it's known more colloquially as the Lynching Memorial. It's an absolutely overpowering memorial to the thousands of Black men and Black women and some white folks, some Jewish folks who were lynched during the period of slavery and then all the way up until the late 1940s. It was started by a group you've probably heard of called the Equal Justice Initiative and Brian Stevenson. His book, Just Mercy, is a very important document about the need for social justice. His offices are here in town, and he is a very prominent figure here in Montgomery. But I say all this because I would like you to note that the juxtaposition of the, I'm pointing to this map like you can see my finger here, but just below the green spot, you'll see Pleasant Avenue. So the house where Scott and Zelda would have courted intersects with the backside of the National Memorial for Peace or Justice. And my Montgomery office is just off to the northeast corner of the National Memorial. So when I say I could step out my back window and look up into Pleasant Avenue, right now, if I were to step out there, what I would look up to is this facility. And this is what the Lynching Memorial looks like. As you go through it, you go through a series of steel columns named after every county throughout America, not just the South, where men who were, were lynching victims, their names and the dates of their deaths. And there's a lot of statuary to sort of dramatize it or to bring awareness to the role of slavery and Jim Crow in the South in the period since then. Very powerful monument. I use this as a teaching tool. I always make sure my students come up to Montgomery and we spend a little bit of time here going through, and I make them go look up the real life victims who may have inspired lynching victims in stories by William Faulkner, or more locally by Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird, which takes place in a city that's only about 100 miles from here, Harper Lee. And it's an important history for Montgomery as well. This is Brian Stevenson down in the corner, by the way, from the Wall Street Journal. When I was asked to write the introduction to this particular volume, it was right after the Lynching Memorial opened up. And that juxtaposition there made me very aware that Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald were absolutely detached from any awareness of lynching or any sort of, they simply were on the wrong side of history and did not have any sort of interest in desegregation. It's very different. There were members of his generation. You may have read the story just a few weeks ago about Dorothy Parker. When she died in 1967, she bequeathed her ashes in her will to the NAACP, and they've taken care of it for 52 years. And they only reinterred her recently because they were moving their offices up to New York. William Faulkner, much more tortured about the violence of the South. When the Fitzgeralds mention lynching, only in a couple rare instances do they depict it as any sort of crime. So when we were bringing out these stories, I had to deal with the fact that, they do use the N-word. There are derogatory pictures are images of African Americans in here. They're used as sort of Southern picturesque elements. And I was very aware that we needed to address this in some way. In particular, because 3 lynching victims in Montgomery happened in September, late September 1919, just as Scott was getting the word that his first novel would be published, and just as he was hopping on a train in October 1919 to come down and woo Zelda to marry him and to launch his career. That whole story is it's really the sort of fairy tale to the Fitzgerald story, winning over the girl by publishing your first novel. But it's totally oblivious to the racial strife that was going on at the time. 1919 saw more racial violence than just about any other year in American history. We tend to forget that now, but it was called Red Summer. And there were acts of racial violence perpetrated upon communities, Black communities, all throughout the country, Chicago, out in California, a lot of it, of course, in the South. And you may have read recently that they've just uncovered some of the bodies they think they have from the 1921 Tulsa race attack, sometimes called the race riots. It was not a riot. The Black community was attacked by whites and burnt to the ground. But that was 2 years later, sort of considered the end of Red Summer. So Red Summer was a very intense period of, this was when the Ku Klux Klan was getting reactivated and entering an even more dangerous sort of period than it had been at the end of the 19th century. So we had 2 different instances in September 1919 with 3 different African-American men lynched in Montgomery. And those stories had never really been told. I was sort of shocked when I discovered that. And so when I was writing the introduction to this, I was trying to find some way to talk about these stories without condemning Scott and Zelda for not being, for not being for social justice, but at the same time, not denying this history. And to me, the fact that Pleasant Avenue runs perpendicularly into the back of the Lynching Memorial. There's just a street that connects the two, but it feels like the Grand Canyon. And to me, that's a metaphor for what we have left to do in America in order to come to a reckoning with our history. So I tried to talk a little bit about that at the end of the introduction as a way of inviting people to reflect upon the fact that Scott and Zelda's romance didn't take place in a vacuum. And there is a lot more to what was going around the upheaval that was swirling around them as they were writing these, very charming stories of young love. One of the things I love about the Lynching Memorial is when you walk out, there's a quote from Toni Morrison. And as I always tell my English majors, this is not from a speech. This is not from her Nobel Prize acceptance speech. This is not from her comments about Black history. This comes from the novel Beloved. And it means a lot to me that the people that designed this particular landmark looked to literature as a source of an aphorism or a public memorial by which to acknowledge this history. This is spoken in the novel Beloved by a Black female preacher named Baby Suggs. And it's just a wonderful expression because it invites, for African Americans, I think it tells a truer story than the desire that everybody wants to have for racial reconciliation. It's about loving oneself. But for white people, it also says to us, don't try to make this history pretty. Don't try to put it in the past. Understand that some of this stuff is still going on. But in general, I love it for the fact that it comes out of a novel. And it says to me that literature still has a place in this day and age as a source of public commemoration. So that's my that's my PowerPoint and my spiel, and I'll get rid of all of my share screen stuff. And we do have a few minutes, so if anybody if anybody has any questions about Scott and Zelda or about Montgomery that they'd like to ask, I'd love to speak to you. I know that the Connecticut history of Scott and Zelda is getting a lot of attention now because of two friends of mine that did that documentary, Gatsby in Connecticut. If you haven't seen that, I really encourage it. It's on Amazon Prime, and it's also on YouTube for $3 or $4. It's a wonderful documentary, and they have a lot of fun telling that story. Are there any questions I might be able to pose? I see we have 2 in the chat, so let me. Yes, very ironic that that Montgomery would preserve Confederate memorials and let houses go to seed. Montgomery, I think, has always been very ambivalent about its history. And I think part of that is because, the power structure when segregation occurred, it didn't really change. I was teaching the other day a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks from 1971 called In Montgomery, which is getting ready to celebrate next year its Golden Jubilee. And it's about her being hired in 1971 by Ebony magazine to come to town and do an update on racial relations. And it's fascinating because it's written in the form of poetry. She called it verse journalism. And it's a piece that very few people know. So my students were trying to do some things with it in terms of, how far Montgomery has come in 50 years. But yeah, I think we're very different than Savannah or even Monroeville, which is where To Kill a Mockingbird occurred. They've done a much better job than we have in preserving our history. I think for a long time, Montgomery just wanted to forget that it had these two conflicting histories. And actually, when I moved to town in 1993, the city was fairly inhospitable for tourism. And that's been something that's only changed in the last few years because they've realized how much money they could make. Of course, the pandemic has totally put a halt to all of that. But when the Lynching Memorial opened, it brought in 750,000 tourists within the first year. And that's been a huge boom economically to Montgomery. I see somebody saw the John Temple Negro. That's straight from the newspaper of 1919. So there's a different N word you'll see in these 3 stories, unfortunately. Any other questions? Any comments anybody might like to offer?
Well, I guess that must have been very thorough then. And it was.
Well, I see folks are awake still, so that's always a good sign that I didn't put everybody to sleep. So I do appreciate everyone's time. I know it's an intense time and a lot of people have a lot of stressors. We do have a question: which bio of Scott Fitzgerald do I recommend? That's a great question. There was one that came, the most recent one I think is the best. Just in part because it's just so up to date, and it was done just a few years ago. And I'm looking, it's by David S. Brown, and I'm looking at it and I can't remember the title of it. It's called Paradise Lost. And it's a good account. The most famous one is probably from the early 50s, which still reads really well, by Arthur Meisner. He's often credited with sort of kicking off or accelerating the Fitzgerald Renaissance of the 1940s and 50s. But there's a lot of good ones out there. But I would recommend David Brown's. He really paints a wonderful picture of sort of the historical context throughout Fitzgerald's life, and gives him credit for being an intellectual. He talks about a lot of the ideas much more than sort of the drinking and the carousing, which I think tend to get a little too much attention maybe. Any other Any questions?
Thank you very much. It's
Well,
very
thank you.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate your time.
It was a lot of fun to listen to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Y'all are very kind. I hope everyone is surviving the pandemic well and staying safe. Maxwell is still here. Yes, indeed. And actually, it's not that far from downtown. Although I have to tell you, there is a raging controversy right now because the military, Montgomery's school system is so terrible that just in the past week, there's been discussion about what would happen to the city if Maxwell closed down and they moved everything out of here, because they're having a hard time getting officers to want to come and bring their kids to Montgomery, because they either have to pay for private school or try to get in magnet programs. And so there's a lot of anxiety right now about what would happen if the Air Force Base disappeared.
All right.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And
Thank you, Lawrence. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. If anybody would like any more information or has any questions, please feel free to email me. My email is just kcurnutt@troy.edu. As you probably guess, I love talking Fitzgerald, so I'd be happy to hear from anybody that might, if any questions come up.
and there is the book containing
Yeah.
the stories. So
Yes, I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to pick up a copy of the book. My publisher would watch this and get irate with me. I forget to do that for some reason.
well, and it is a small, very interesting publishing house, I will say, from looking at the titles. So
It's a wonderful publishing house. It's an indie publisher, and they do a lot of Southern history, a lot of civil rights history. Wonderful people. A lot of my students internship there, so they've given a lot of my students opportunities, which I'm grateful for. So I would encourage you, go to newsouthbooks.com and you can see you might find other titles there that you're also interested in.
all right, well, I'll say goodbye and good night to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Curnutt. That was great.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Happy Saturday.